handout? Both handouts for today's lecture. Okay, let me start over. There are two handouts for today. One of the handouts is a new handout on the lecture topic for today's class. That is on the Tales of Ise, right? Ise monogatari. The other handout is suggested reading material. This is reading material that has been taken from Japanese Culture, 4th edition by Paul Barley. This is recommended reading. It is the chapter on the Heian period, the Heian period of Japanese history that we have been looking at since last week. We will continue to look at literature from the Heian period this week, and then for approximately 2 more weeks. Right, so this is a rather lengthy period, if you recall. So I would recommend, if you have some time, to at least glance through the suggested reading. Right? Now, if you will please turn to page 5 in the handout from last week, Tale of the Bamboo Cutter. Remember that we had been talking about the human qualities, characteristics, human behavior that Kaguya-hime, our heroine, begins to display toward the end of the story, right as she is about to make her return to the celestial palace on the moon. We had looked at this particular passage, and if you recall, there are certain lines in the passages that reflect this new display of human-like motions. For example, human-like emotions, I should say. For example, it won't be easy to go without doing anything for my parents. Previously in the story, she probably would not have had that much concern for the welfare, the well-being of her parents. In fact, what we saw earlier in the story was that Kaguya-hime was more concerned about the fact that she might possibly have to marry one of her 5 suitors, or the emperor. Remember that? But now, toward the end of the story, we see that there is a change in her behavior, her disposition, especially toward the bamboo cutter and his wife, because they have taken care of her, they have raised her, and now she wishes to repay that kindness. Another line in the passage, "That's why I've been so sad. I can't bear to go away knowing I've been nothing but a bother to you. It doesn't make me happy to be going there, the celestial palace on the moon. I want to be here when you get old and feeble so that I can take care of you in your old age." What other lines in these final concluding passages of the story do we see this type of behavior in Kaguya-hime? What other lines, what other actual lines of the text can you raise as examples? Can you give me as examples that reflect this type of behavior on the part of Kaguya-hime? Anybody have any ideas? It's not just this particular slide, but look at the remaining slides. Look at the remaining slides in your handout. Can anyone give me any examples of how Kaguya-hime displays these more human-like emotions, characteristics? Give me some specific lines in the passages. Anybody? Any ideas? We'll come back to this slide in a few minutes. How about this particular slide? This would be page 6, middle left-hand side of the page. Did anybody pick up on a particular line or two in this passage that reflects the more human-like emotions, characteristics that Kaguya-hime displays to the end of the story? What particular action, what particular intentional action do we see here? Yes? Leaving it as what? As a present, as a keepsake, as a memento. Let's look at this. The heavenly beings had brought along a box, which one of them carried. It contained a heavenly feathered robe. There was also another box containing an elixir of immortality. one of the heavenly beings brought the elixir to Kaguya-hime. Drink the elixir in this jar. You must be feeling sick after having eaten food in an unclean place. I will come back to this passage in a few minutes. Kaguya-hime took a tiny sip. She started to wrap the jar in the robe she had removed with the thought of leaving it as a small keepsake, as a memento. Why? Because she wants to leave it so that the emperor, when looking at it, will be reminded of her. Right? But the heavenly being stopped her. So this particular action could be given as another example of the type of human, more human-like characteristics, behavior that Kaguya-hime displays at the end of the story. Now let's back up to these lines that refer to unclean place. This is a reference to the world of the bamboo cutter, right? The world to which Kaguya-hime has come from her world, which is depicted in sharp contrast. Let's back up a little bit to this particular slide. This would be toward the top left of page 6. The king brought the carriage to the roof without bothering to answer. Kaguya-hime, why do you linger in that unclean place? He said. The locked strong room door flew open in a twinkling. So here, the king, in other words, the king from the celestial palace on the moon, has come to fetch Kaguya-hime, to carry her back, to take her back to the moon. He compares the world of the bamboo cutter, our world on earth, to an unclean place. This is a reference to a Buddhist concept called onri-edo. Right, the full term is onri-edo. And this indicates a disliking, distaste for the unclean, impure world of humans. This is how the world of humans is depicted in much of the literature of the Heian period. It is in sharp contrast with the celestial, pure world of Kaguya-hime. Remember that she is the superhuman, heavenly being with supernatural powers. She was born in a stalk of bamboo, after which the bamboo cutter is able to find gold in the same stalk of bamboo. So she has these supernatural powers. So, to return to the previous slide that we had been looking at, you must be feeling sick after having eaten food in an unclean place. Again, a reference to this idea of onri-edo, right? The unclean, impure world of humans. And again, she leaves a memento, a keepsake, for the emperor to remember her by. This is a very human-like action, isn't it? We tend to want to give a loved one or someone special something, some physical object to remind them of ourselves. So we give that to them as a keepsake. This would be something out of character for heavenly beings, for they have no such emotions. Right? They have no attachment, right, to others as we do on earth. Now, to back up a bit, there is this reference to heavenly feathered robe. Heavenly feathered robe. What is this? Well, looking at the next slide, wait a minute, says Kaguya-hime. I've heard that once a person is dressed in a robe like that, she no longer possesses a human heart. Right? So once she dons this feathered robe, supposedly she will be freed of these human emotions, human-like emotions, the ones that tether us, the ones that keep us attached to one another. There's something I need to say, however. And she begins to write on a piece of paper. What do you expect she will write on this piece of paper? You should probably be able to anticipate this and guess what is going to happen next without even knowing. What is she going to actually write on this piece of paper? Okay, in what form? What form of writing? A poem, that's right. She is probably going to write a poem. Again, this courtly exchange of poetry, dialogue between men and women took place in the form of poetry in most cases. Before we go on to that poem, let us take a look at the story of the heavenly feathered robe. This is something that we actually see in other ancient Japanese tales. The story of Kaguya-hime itself, the story of the bamboo cutter, is based on several other tales, older tales, that have been passed down in the oral tradition. So let's look at one of them. We have the story of the heavenly maiden whose feathered robe is actually stolen from her on a visit to Earth. This is Hagoromo densetsu in Japanese. It is one of the older tales, folk tales, that have been passed down orally. So there is some written record of it, but again, because it's been passed down in the oral tradition, there are going to be different variations of the story, and other stories are going to be based on it. And this is the case with the tale of the bamboo cutter. In this story, Hagoromo densetsu, the heavenly maiden cannot return without this feathered robe. She cannot return to the heavens. And so she is forced to stay on Earth. What we find, though, is in the story, the man that she marries, that she eventually marries here on Earth, is the man who arranged to have the robe stolen in the first place. Eventually, at the end of the story, she will reclaim the robe and return to the heavenly skies. So this is one of the original older stories that contains reference to the heavenly feathered robe, the one that provides immortality and freedom from human emotions. Now, let's return to the story of Kaguya-hime and see what she does with the paper and the poem that she writes to the emperor. She attached the jar of elixir to the paper, summoned the head chamberlain, middle captain, and gave instructions for the poem to be transmitted. It was a heavenly being who transmitted it. The moment the middle captain received it, someone dressed Kaguya-hime in the heavenly feathered robe. No longer did the maiden consider the old man pitiful or pathetic, for one who dons such a robe is emancipated, is freed from sorrow. She entered the carriage and soared into the heavens, escorted by 100 heavenly beings. The middle captain, the commander, returned to the palace with his men. He reported in detail the reasons why he and his men had failed with their weapons to prevent Kaguya-hime from departing. He also presented the jar of elixir with the letter attached. The emperor, upon receiving it, felt much distressed when he opened the letter and read Kaguya-hime's words. Later, the emperor summoned his ministers and great nobles and asked them which mountain was closest to heaven. One man replied, "The mountain in the province of Suruga. It is near both to the capital and to heaven." And in response to Kaguya-hime's poem, as would be customary fashion, the emperor then replies with his own poem. And this is his poem. "Au koto mo namida ni ukabu. Wagami ni wa shinanu kusuri mo nani ni kawasen." What use is it, this elixir of immortality, to one who floats in tears because he cannot meet her again? In other words, what use is this elixir of immortality to me now that I no longer have Kaguya-hime to be with? All right. So what does he do with this keepsake? Well, first, he gave the poem and the jar containing the elixir to a messenger with the command that he take them to the summit of the mountain in Suruga. What mountain in Suruga would this be? Suruga is the old name for the province that corresponds to Shizuoka Prefecture, right, that area. And so it would be Mount Fuji. Right, that is the mountain that they are talking about. He directed that the letter and the jar be placed side by side, set on fire, and allowed to be consumed in the flames. Ever since they burnt the elixir of immortality on the summit, people have called the mountain by the name Fuji, meaning immortal. This is another play on words because we have the word fushi, which means to not die, literally, to not die, or immortality, right? To be immortal. And we have the word Fuji, right? Written with entirely different characters, of course. But this is one of the supposed stories behind the word origin of the mountain's name. Just one. Even now, the smoke is still said to rise into the clouds. Smoke from the mountain. Most of you know, of course, that now no smoke rises from the top, from the cone of Mount Fuji. Mount Fuji is a volcanic mountain. Right? At one time, it was active. And some scholars believe that this particular line in this passage is an indication of Mount Fuji's activity during this time, during the time when this particular monogatari was written. If we look at the preface, the kanajo to Kokin Wakashu, the first of the imperial waka anthologies, we see a line in it that says, nowadays, no smoke rises from Mount Fuji either. If you recall, the Kokin Wakashu anthology, we do know the exact date that it was compiled, and that was 905, right, at the turn of the century, right at the beginning of the 10th century. So, most likely, if this particular line is an actual historical record of the activity of Mount Fuji at the time, then we can probably surmise that the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter was most likely finished before the Kokin Wakashu was compiled. In other words, before 905 AD. Okay. Everyone got that down? Okay. That is about all we have time for the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter. Right. Next, I would like for us to turn to the new handout for today's lecture, and that would be on another monogatari. That would be the Ise monogatari. So while you are getting that handout out and ready, I'm going to go ahead and pass around this particular translation of the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter. The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter apparently is one of the more popular works of literature when it comes to this course, especially when it comes to writing the term paper at the end of this course. So I will go ahead and pass around this particular translation. This is a full translation, a full-length translation of the entire work. And it also contains a modern Japanese translation, along with the original Japanese. So you get all three in one work, in one volume. It also contains woodcutting illustrations, for example, of the kind shown here. Right, so go ahead and thumb through this, and you'll get a flavor for, a feel for how this particular work is translated into both modern Japanese and English. The English translation was done by Donald King, one of the foremost scholars of Japanese literature, classical Japanese literature, as well as modern Japanese literature. Everyone ready? Everyone has both handouts? New handouts. Okay, let's go ahead and begin. We have been looking at Heian period literature. All right, last lecture, this lecture, and then going forward for the next two. We need to keep in mind one important point when it comes to looking at Heian period literature, and hopefully it will become more obvious as we proceed through the course. And that is the fact that Heian period literature is characterized by the fact, distinguished by the fact that it is literature of the court. Literature of the court, meaning that much of the literature that is produced, and we saw last week that there are many, many new genres, many new types of literature, especially prose literature, that are developed during this period. Much of it was written by members of the court, right? Members of the nobility, including, of course, members of the imperial family, and then others who would be serving them at court. Okay? So it was literature that was produced by the court and then also read by members of the court, appreciated by members of the nobility. The commoners, the masses, are not going to play as big a role in literature, in either the production or the appreciation of literature, until a little bit later in Japanese history. We will see that happening toward the end of the next period and then in later periods. So the Kamakura, Muromachi, and then later periods. Okay, so today we'll be looking at the next of the monogatari, the next of the narrative fictional works. This one also is anonymous. We don't know the actual author. It may have been more than one author. It may have been a number of people who had a hand in the compiling of this work of literature. We don't know the exact date of the compilation or the completion of Ise Monogatari. It is supposed that it was completed probably toward the late 9th century through the middle part of the following century, 10th century. So sometime between the late 9th and mid-10th centuries. This particular monogatari is a little bit different from what we saw in the previous lecture. The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, it at least had a plot, right, from beginning to end. It had a storyline. It had characters that consistently appear throughout the story. With the Tales of Ise, it's a little bit different. This is rather a collection, a series of individual episodes, short, very short, brief episodes, chapters that comprise the entire monogatari. It is believed that this monogatari was probably edited over a number of stages. So it probably took a number of steps, a number of stages of editing for the entire monogatari to be completed in the form that we know today. And so some of the chapters may have been originally written in a different order, put together in a different order. We don't know the exact original sequence. But we do know that by looking at the different chapters in the monogatari today, that each of them centers pretty much around poems, one or more poems in each of those chapters. So you will find that these poems, waka or uta, become one of the central focuses of the entire monogatari itself and each chapter. So scholars tend to classify this particular monogatari as an uta monogatari. Uta meaning literally song or poem. The other monogatari that we saw a while ago, Tale of Bamboo Cutter, is usually classified as a tsukuri monogatari. Tsukuru means to make, literally, to create. So a creative work of fiction. This particular monogatari, as well as the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, was read and studied as a classic in its own time. And this is an important point to keep in mind. We know from looking at the Tale of Genji, which will follow in about 100 or so years, we know that the people of the Heian period read and knew about this work of literature. They were expected, in fact, to know the poems that are contained in the Tales of Ise or the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter. This is classical literature in its own time. We have a presumed model for the tale, Ariwara no Narihira. This is an actual person. He was a mid-9th century government official and also a well-known, renowned poet. And he was also of imperial descent. He was the grandson of Emperor Heisei. The Emperor Heisei was the second emperor to rule over Heian-kyo after the capital was transferred from Nara. And so he is of imperial descent. How is Ariwara no Narihira described? How is he depicted in the literature and other official historical documents? Well, you'll find that he is characterized as the sensitive aristocrat, the ideal prince, the ideal romantic hero. In one of the 6 national histories of the early Heian period and also of the Nara period, this particular history, called the Sandai Jitsuroku, describes Narihira as a handsome man of physical appearance who acted of his own free will, and he was a man who excelled in waka poetry. Interestingly, Narihira was not particularly known for his Chinese verse. Even though Chinese verse was indeed one of the standards of the day, he is praised in many documents, many historical records, for his excellence in waka poetry, but not Chinese verse. Am I going too quickly? I need to wait. I need to write that down. Okay? All right. If we look at, for example, the preface to the Kokin Wakashu, called the Kanajo, and the Kanajo, or preface, of the Kokin Wakashu is considered the first real poetics in the history of Japanese literature. Right? Written by Kino Tsurayuki. Remember, he was the main compiler, or one of the main compilers of the Kokin Wakashu. Poetics meaning it was really the first study of poetry, first scholarly written work on poetry, Japanese literature, how poetry is written, has been written, and should be written. We get a feel for how people in Kino Tsurayuki's day looked at poetry, how they evaluated it. And in this, it says that Narihira is one of the 6 illustrious poets, Rokkasen. There are others, but he was one of the 6. So that gives us an indication of his prestige, his evaluation by his contemporaries. But at the same time, Narihira's poetry itself is described as excessive in heart and lacking in words. And if you look at the original, Hariwara no Narihira wa, その心余りて言葉足らず. Kokoro means heart. Amarite means to be excessive or to be overly indulgent, etc. And then kotoba, words, phrases, tarasu, to be lacking in. And then it goes on further to compare, metaphorically, Narihira's poetry to a flower, shiboberu hana, to a flower that has withered, that has faded, is past its peak, and no longer has its visual beauty, its color, iro nakute, nioi nokoreru ga gotoshi. So only its fragrance remains. The only thing that remains of it is its fragrance. And this is how Narihira's poetry is described in the preface to the Kokin Wakashu. So, what does this indicate? Probably the obscurity of many of his poems. In fact, 30 of his poems are contained in the Kokin Wakashu itself. So that is an indication of his popularity, the prestige, the reputation that he had achieved by his time. But at the same time, in the preface, we see that many of his poems were probably a little bit hard to interpret because of the lack of words. You would have to read between the lines, right, in order to understand, to grasp the meaning behind some of his poetry. I see that some of you are still writing, taking memos, so I will wait a few seconds before proceeding. Okay, everyone noting that down? Let's move on. So, if you will, please turn to the first slide in the handout for today. Before we look at the actual monogatari, Tales of Ise, let's first look at some of the poetry of this period. Right? Contained, for example, in the Kokin Wakashu, and this one by Ariwara no Narihira, our model for the Tales of Ise. This is poem number 53 in scroll 1 of the collection. This is, if you'll recall from the last lecture, a scroll on springtime poems. Springtime poems. And the title of the poem, On Seeing Cherry Blossoms at the Nagisano Inn. And this is what, supposedly, Narihira had to say about those cherry blossoms. 世の中に生えて桜の中にせば春の心はのどけからまし Ah, if in this world there were only no such thing as cherry blossoms, then perhaps in the springtime our hearts could be at peace. What is he saying here? Ah, if in this world there were only no such thing as cherry blossoms. This is an interesting line. When you think about it, you would expect poets to be talking about the beauty of the cherry blossom. The cherry blossom has bloomed, it's beautiful, springtime has arrived, etc. This is the kind of poetry that you might expect poets to be writing. But, in fact, Narihira says that, oh, only if there were no such thing as the beautiful cherry blossoms. Why does he say this? Perhaps in the springtime, if there were really no cherry blossoms, then our hearts could be at peace. We could be at peace. Why? Because we know that even though, yes, the cherry blossoms are indeed beautiful, and they indicate that springtime has arrived, we also know that as a rule, cherry blossoms must eventually wither and fall. They will fall to the ground, right, as a rule. So, in other words, their beauty is fleeting. It's transient, and we know that. We know that once the cherry blossom has bloomed, eventually it's going to fall from the tree. So, we might be spared that sense of loss if there were no cherry blossoms in the first place. But, as Stephen Carter has pointed out, this particular poem, at first glance, appears to be a straightforward declaration on the beauty of the cherry blossoms. But Narihira manages to hint at a truth that one might call the aesthetic paradox. Yes, we might be more at peace without those beautiful cherry blossoms. We wouldn't have to worry about them falling to the ground. But if we didn't have their beauty in the first place, would spring really be springtime? So this is probably what Narihira is really trying to say, right, through this one very short work of verse. It's not literally spoken. It's not literally written in the poem itself. You have to kind of read between the lines. And this is an example of the kind of convoluted, complicated type of poetic writing that we see becoming more and more popular, more and more frequently encountered as we proceed through the Heian period and later periods. The next poem, in slide 2, also from the Kokin Wakashu, the second scroll, this one by Ono no Komachi, a female poet of the Heian period, also one of the Rokkasen, right? One of the 6 illustrious poets. Ono no Komachi is sometimes referred to as one of the 3 world beauties, one of the 3 most beautiful women in the world. Whether there is evidence for that, I don't know. But let's look at her poem. She talks about her beauty, okay, but let's see what she has to say about it. Hana no iro wa utsuri ni kei na, itazura ni, waga ni yo ni furu, nagame seshimai. Behold my flower, its beauty wasted away on idle concerns that have kept me gazing out as time coursed by with the rains. This is rather quite a mouthful for this one line. Behold my flower. Right? Hana no iro wa. Iro usually refers to visual beauty, right, during this time. Right? Iro nowadays can mean color, right, literally color, but it also means visual beauty, especially when we were talking about flowers in bloom, a visual scene, a landscape. Hana no iro wa, so the visual beauty of my flower. Utsuri ni ke ni na, itazura ni, waga ni yo ni furu, nagame se shimai. Beauty wasted away. Why? Because she has been gazing idly, gazing out on idle concerns as time coursed by with the rains. Time has passed. Right? Time has passed. The hours have passed, the days have passed, the months have passed, and she finds that now her beauty has been wasted away because she has been gazing out idly. This is a rather complex poem itself. Why? Because we have a number of plays on words, right, involving kake kotoba, the pivot words, if you recall from previous lectures. Again, these involve the use of homophones, right, words that have the same pronunciation, right, but different meaning. Right, let's look at a few examples. One, we have the word yoni furu. Furu can mean to age, written like this. It can also mean to pass, as in time passing, time forced by, so written like this. And then it can also mean to fall, as in the rain falling or snow falling from the sky. All right, so we have this one rather complex, right? 3 different possibilities. Another example of a kake kotoba in use here is the word nagame. Right, here we have one meaning, long rain, because we can put together naga or nagai, long, with the word for rain, which is ame. So naga ame becoming nagame. It can also mean reference to gazing, nagame. We have the word nagameru in modern Japanese as well. Right? So gazing out, looking out the window, daydreaming idly, right? Nagameru. So here again, a play on words. So this is the kind of convoluted, complex use of rhetorical devices that becomes more and more popular, more and more frequent in the poetry of this period. So not only the poet himself or herself, but also the reader would be expected to be able to pick up on this use of rhetorical devices. For example, the kake kotoba, or engo, or jokotoba. And also, we had mentioned a while ago that hana no iro means the beauty of the flowers in bloom. Some scholars believe that, or have interpreted that this line, hana no iro, or this phrase, is a reference to the beauty of Ononokomachi herself. And she is talking perhaps about her own beauty that has faded with the passing of time. Right? So there are many, many, many levels within this single poem. So you have to work your way through all of those levels in order to achieve a complete or nearly complete interpretation, the interpretation that the poet originally intended. Okay? So again, the poetry, if you'll remember, is marked by witty expressions. For example, the use of kake kotoba, engo. Remember, engo are the related words, the words that have a common denominator. Remember the poem from The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter. Remember the poem contained the words eda for branch and ha, koto no ha, or a reference to leaves. Both branch and leaves, eda and ha, are parts of a tree. Right? So a tree would be the common denominator for those 2 words. That is an example of engo. And other rhetorical devices, and we'll look at those later on in the course. So you can gather from this that there is an emphasis on intellect, intricate reasoning. This was what was required not only of the poet, but also of the reader. You were expected to have a knowledge of poetry itself, the canon of poetry that was written prior to this period, and you were expected to have a knowledge of the intricate rhetorical devices, poetic devices that were used in the poetry. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. Slide 3 in your handout discusses the role of poetry in Heian court life. And I emphasize court life, right? The life of the nobles, the life of the nobility. We have already talked briefly about this, but let's go ahead and reconfirm. Throughout the classical age, or the Heian period, poetry was at the very heart of court life, used in witty conversation at court, for correspondence between friends, and perhaps most importantly, for messages between lovers. And this is what we will see, especially in a work like the Tales of Ise. We saw it in the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, of course. We will see it again next week in the Tale of Genji. So this is a very, very important point when it comes to analyzing poetry and how it was used, how it was composed socially, as a part of social etiquette. In fact, if you look, for example, at the Kokin Wakashu, right, it contains some 20 scrolls of poetry, and 5 of those 20 scrolls are devoted to the topic of love. Right? So we have 5 of these 20 scrolls devoted entirely to the topic of romance, right? The relationships between the men and women of the day. So that comprises roughly a third of all of the poems in the Kokin Wakashu. So that gives you another idea of how important poetry was in the area of romance. Along with calligraphy and musical talent, the ability to compose a good poem was considered an essential accomplishment of the highborn. Again, I've mentioned this over and over again. You were expected to have a knowledge of poetry if you were one of the educated, a member of the upper classes. Chinese influences in diction and imagery, theme and tenor were again prominent. Composing poetry was no idle pastime, but a serious business involving the mastery of rhetorical techniques, jokotoba, takekotoba, etc., and knowledge of a canon. Much of the poetry of the period, not nearly all of which was in the uta form, the waka form, was of course never recorded. But tales such as Genji Monogatari make it clear that it was indeed a constant feature of court life. And it's not only the monogatari, but also diaries and memoirs, the journals of the time, that are also filled with examples of waka. Right? We had talked about last week Tosanikki, the diary, the personal memoir of Kino Tsurayuki. Remember, he had been sent to the province of Tosa, right, to serve as governor there for 5 years, but his daughter dies en route, and his poetic journal is filled with poems that speak of her death and the sense of loss as a result of losing his child. Okay. So now, let's look at the Tales of Ise. Right, this will be slide 4 in your handout. We're going to start with chapter 23. Right, so we're going to start a little bit into the story. This one talks about a young boy and a young girl who will eventually grow up and get married. Right, let's look at their relationship, and let's look at how it evolves. Right, this is an interesting relationship. It evolves in an interesting manner. Let's see how that happens. Read along with me. A boy and a girl, the children of 2 men who traveled over the countryside, used to play together beside a well. As they grew up, they both felt rather self-conscious about continuing the old relationship, but the boy had set his heart on marrying the girl, and she was determined that she would be his wife. So they've grown up together from childhood. They've known each other for a very long time, and they're a little bit shy about this and continuing the old relationship, but both of them share the same feelings, so they decide to marry one another. The boy refused to agree when her father tried to betroth her to someone else. It is not uncommon at all for members of the nobility, especially for members of the nobility and upper classes, to enter into arranged marriages, even at a very young age. You'll need to keep this in mind. But she, in this case, has refused, right, to accept the partner that her father wishes her to marry. Instead, she has her heart set on the young boy. And what does he do next? Well, this is something that you would expect because it's part of the courtship process during this period. The boy decides to send the girl a poem, right? And this is the poem. Since last I saw you, it seems to have grown. It meaning my height. It seems to have grown until I am the taller of the two of us. Right, we both have grown, but I, it seems, am the one who has grown taller. My height that we two measured against the curve of the well. Tsutsui no izutsu ni kakeshi monogatari. Sugi ni kerashi na imo mizaruma ni. Imo is a reference to the young girl, right? His beloved girl, right? The woman he wants to marry. So what they have done is, in the past, they apparently measured their height, right, against the curve of a well that was on the grounds. And now, when they measure their height with one another, they find that it's the boy who has grown taller. Why would he write a poem like this? Why would he deliberately speak of his height that has grown considerably, such that he is now the taller of the two? Why would he intentionally write a poem like this and send it to the young woman? What is he trying to say by saying that he is now the taller of the two? Anybody have an idea? Yes?
Maybe it's a very subtle way to say that he's they're adults now, so the time has come to marry.
That's right, right. Most likely he is trying to indicate to her that, oh, look at me now. You know, I've grown. I'm a grown man now. I'm an adult. I've reached the age that I am now ready to marry. Right? So this is his subtle way of really offering proposal of marriage to the girl. Right? This among all of the poems, right? He sends a number of them. Right? It's not just this one poem. Now, let's see what happens next. As you might expect, as would be customary fashion, part of the social decorum of the day, etiquette, she quickly responds, right? Because this is expected of people who were educated in poetry and the process of courtship, right, that is based on this romantic exchange of poetic verse. So this is how she replies. The mid-parted hair, I once measured against yours, hangs toward my waist. For whom should it be put up unless it be for you? Right, so the mid-parted hair that she refers to, her own hair, mid-parted, this is the hairstyle that was worn by young girls, very young girls, probably really up until the age of 8 or so. Right, so very, very young girls would wear their hair mid-parted like this and hanging down toward the waist. Right, so here in the original, furiwake nani is how it's referred to in the Japanese. I once measured against yours, hangs toward my waist. All right. Now, for whom should it be put up, unless it be for you? All right, so this is a use of what we call in Japanese hango, right, or a rhetorical expression. She's asking, so for whom should I put up my hair that hangs down toward my waist? It could only be you. There would be no other man that I would put my hair up as an indication that I too have come of age. Right? I have come of age and I am now ready to enter into marriage. Right? And the partner that I would enter into marriage with is no other man but you. Okay? After many such poems had passed between them, their wishes were realized and they became man and wife. So they go through the process of courtship, courtly exchange of poetry, and they get married. Now, what happens after this? Some years later, all right, so some years have passed. The wife's father died, leaving her without support. And the husband, tired of living with her in poverty, took to visiting a woman in the Takayasu district of Kawachi province. This is not unusual. Why? Because we need to consider the fact that in this period, and really in the earlier Nara period as well, members of the nobility, men of the upper classes, would often take on more than one wife. Remember that polygamy was entirely socially acceptable in these days. So, a man having a number of choices when it comes to a marriage partner would then look to the woman's financial status. Why? Because the man relied on the woman for financial support. And how would that financial support be provided? Through the woman's father. Right? So the woman's paternal support is a very, very important factor when it comes to marriage in the Heian period. The man is going to look to the woman's father for financial support and also as a means of climbing the ladder in terms of political success in many cases as well. If the man is looking for a higher position at court, he is probably going to look to marry a woman whose father is of high status, who has achieved a high political position and prominence at the imperial court, because that would assure him of a successful career at court. So the importance of a woman's paternal support, right, is a key factor in marriage in Heian society. Okay? So what happens in this story is that the wife's father has died. Right? So she no longer has the support, financial support, that she once enjoyed. Hence, her husband must also suffer with her, right, in poverty. He becomes tired of this, and he decides to look elsewhere. And so he decides to start visiting a new woman in a province called Kawachi. The wife, however, interestingly, behaves like this. Let's see. The wife always saw him off with so little apparent resentment that he began to suspect her of having a lover. Right? So you would expect, right, that a woman who has been abandoned, pretty much, by her husband, or neglected, at least, by her husband, would probably show feelings of resentment, right, jealousy, hatred, and she might actually voice these, right, feelings. But indeed, this woman, the wife, does not. And what does she do? In fact, one day, after pretending to set out for Kawachi, the man hid in the shrubbery and watched her, because he now has suspicious feelings toward her. Right? He harbors this suspicion that she perhaps has taken on a new lover. And so he wants to confirm his suspicions, and so he pretends to go out, but then he waits in the shrubbery and spies on her. What does she do, though? She made up her face with meticulous care and recited this poem, Gazing into Space. So this is something a little bit unexpected, something that we would not anticipate a woman who has been neglected by her husband, right, to do. Right? But instead she makes up her face carefully. She takes the time to attend to her appearance, right? Because even though she knows her husband is going out to visit another woman, right, she still takes the time to take care of herself, her appearance. Now let's see how this contrasts with the other woman in Kawachi. First, the poem that the wife reads aloud as her husband is spying on her. Is he journeying alone in the dead of night across that mountain, whose name recalls waves at sea rising when the tempest blows? So she is indicating here that she is concerned about her husband, even though she knows that her husband is going out, going across this mountain, Tatsutayama, right, that recalls waves at sea. okitsu-shiranami. So these high waves that are created by the strong tempestuous winds. Right? Kaze fukeba, okitsu-shiranami tatsutaya. So she's worried that her husband is journeying all alone across this very dangerous pass. Now, what do you expect is going to happen next? The man, upon hearing this poem that expresses concern for his well-being, his heart swelled with love for her, and his visits to Kawachi ceased. On the rare occasions when the man did go to Takayasu, he observed that the woman there had abandoned all decorum, despite the great pains she had taken with her appearance at first. Now, this is something I think that is an interesting commentary on human nature, perhaps. We can all relate to this idea that at the beginning of a relationship, both sides usually take great pains to keep up their appearances, to be on their best behavior at the beginning of a relationship. But as time goes on, we see that sometimes one or the other of the couple will become a little lax, right? They will tend to let the little things go. And this is what has happened with the woman in Kawachi. Watching her seize the rice ladle and heap her bowl to overflowing, he felt so disenchanted that he finally severed the connection altogether. So he decides that he is no longer going to continue the relationship with the woman in Kawachi. One day, the woman in Kawachi composed this poem as she looked toward Yamato. Yamato would be the location where the man is, residing with his original wife. Though rain may fall, I beg you clouds, do not hide Ikoma Mountain, because this is where her husband, the man, is located. For I think only of seeing the place where my beloved dwells. Now, upon receiving this poem, the man is somewhat moved. Right? He's somewhat moved by this gesture, and he decides to send word that he would indeed come to visit her. She waited in joyous anticipation, but he failed to appear. So he never actually does go to Kawachi to see her. After the same thing had happened several times, she decides to send him the next poem. Night after night, right, I have awaited the visits that you promised to make. Though I no longer trust you, I spend my days in longing. Right, so I know that I can no longer trust you. I know that your words are no longer truthful, but I still, I still spend my days waiting day after day in longing for your arrival, for your visit. We have seen this theme before, right? Poems that talk about a woman's longing, yearning for the arrival of a lover. We saw that with the Manyoshu. And we will see it in other works of Heian period literature. This is a common theme. For example, Hagoromo Nikki. Right, this is one of the journals, one of the personal memoirs written by a noblewoman of the Heian court. The mother, she is described, referred to usually as the mother of Fujiwara no Michitsuna, right? Fujiwara no Michitsuna no haha, the mother of this man. And in her diary, she writes of being pretty much neglected, almost entirely abandoned for certain periods of time by her husband. And she speaks of the jealousy, the feelings of hatred, resentment that she feels toward the man, Kanye, her husband. So you'll find this theme being played out over and over again. It's a recurring theme, especially in the literature of this period. We will see it again in the tale of Genji when we look at the story of the lady Rokujo, right, whose evil spirit comes back to haunt the women who Genji, the hero, marries. Right? So the spirit of Lady Rokujo will try to wreak havoc upon the lives of the other women in Genji's life. So we'll see that next week. Now, what happens after this, even though she sends the man this poem, he never came again. Right? And this is how this particular episode ends. And many of the episodes in the Tales of Ise end rather abruptly like this. And so really it's the poems that form the backbone of many of the chapters in the Tales of Ise. Let's look at another chapter. This would be slide 11. Once a man who had lately come of age went hunting on his estate at Kasuga village, near the Nara capital. In the village there lived two beautiful young sisters. The man stole a look at the sisters and quite lost his head. So startling and incongruous did it seem, so unbelievably surprising did it seem for such women to be dwelling at the ruined capital. Because they're so beautiful, you would expect them to be from the present capital, from Heian. You wouldn't expect such a beautiful woman to be living in the old desolate ruins of Nara, in the countryside. Immediately, what does he do? He tears a strip from the skirt of his hunting robe, dashes off a poem, and sends it in, because this would be customary fashion. This would be part of the social etiquette required of the nobility. The fabric of the robe was imprinted with a moss fern design, right? And we'll see why this is important. Now, the act of doing something like this, instantaneously, on the spot, tearing a strip from one's hunting garment and then writing a poem, composing a poem on it, and then sending it, probably via messenger, to the women. This act would be considered miyabi. Right? And this is a new term that we're going to be introduced to, and one that we will also see in other works of literature. Miyabi refers to the courtly elegance that is characterized by sophistication and refined taste, especially in matters of courtship, in matters of love, romantic love between a man and woman. This is the kind of behavior, the kind of decorum that was expected, again, of men and women of the noble classes. It was considered an ideal trait, in fact, of men and women of the nobility. And it is particularly exemplified by our model, Ariwara no Narihira, the Mukashi Otoko, right, in many of the chapters of the Tales of Ise. And so you will want to remember this particular concept, this key word, miyabi. Okay? You want to write that down? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on. If you need to look at the slides again, please come see me after class, and I'll be happy to show you any slides that you need to see again. Okay, so let's look at an example of this miyabi, this idea of courtly elegance and sophistication. Slide 12. Right, this is the actual poem, supposedly, that the man has written on the piece of garment, piece of fabric that he has torn from his hunting robe. Like the random patterns on this robe, dyed with young purple, wakamurasaki, from Kasuga Plain. Utterly confused is the heart of one secretly in love. This is a metaphorical comparison being made between the utter confusion that he feels in his heart now that he has seen these beautiful women. He compares that confusion to the random, confused patterns of this robe, the hunting robe that he is wearing, that has been dyed with young purple from Kasuga Plain. The random patterns are described in the original as shinobu no midare. Shinobu no midare. And then, after composing this poem and sending it in, it occurs to him that this was an interesting opportunity for an adaptation of another poem that runs like this. It is you alone who have set my heart astir with emotions as confused as moss fern patterns on cloth from Michinoku. So it's the same sort of idea. He's still making another figurative comparison between his confused emotions, the confusion that he feels in his heart, with the confused moss fern patterns on this cloth from Michinoku. Where is Michinoku? This is a location. I will come back to this in a minute. Let's look at the map. This is included in your handout. It's on the very last page, slide 30. Heian capital, for the middle, for the central part of Japan. And then Michinoku is an actual location in northeastern Japan. This would be the Tohoku region, right? Michinoku province. So this is the province that he is referring to in this poem. Right? Supposedly, if we go back, the cloth is from this area, Michinoku, and it has been imprinted with a moss fern pattern, a confusing pattern that is similar to the confusion that he feels in his heart. Right? So in the original Japanese, we have shinobu mojizuri. So this is the confused moss fern pattern. Now, why is this important? Because if you remember, the man decides that he would like to adapt an earlier poem, right, to write his own poem to send to the women. This particular poem that the man has composed is actually an adaptation from a famous waka poem by an earlier poet, Minamoto no Toru. Right? And this idea of adapting one's poem from an earlier work is considered miyabi in itself. Right? It is considered something that the courtly nobles would have done in their time as part of the courtship process. This particular poem, written on a strip of cloth taken from the hem of the man's hunting garment, is imprinted with the same moss fern pattern described in Minamoto no Toru's original poem. All right, so this borrowing of a phrase or an idea from an earlier poem, we will see this poetic device being used in the poetry of this period as well as later periods. It becomes a frequently used poetic device. Right? And the reader would also be expected to know this. Once they saw this particular poem or heard it, they should immediately be reminded of the original poem, because it's the original poem that would evoke, conjure up certain emotions, certain ideas. And that was the idea behind borrowing it in the first place. Okay. And then, after the poem is composed, we will see in the Tales of Ise, in several episodes, that there is commentary provided by the author. For example, here it says people were remarkably elegant in those times. This is a direct reference to this idea of miyabi. Right? This is an example of subjective commentary by the author. Right? So this is not actually a part of the events of the story itself, but subjective commentary offered by the author. Okay. Looking at the next chapter. This would be chapter 9, slide 14 in your handout. Once, a certain man decided it was useless for him to stay in the capital. Accompanied by one or two old friends, he set out toward the east in search of a province where he could settle down. Since none of the party knew the way, they simply blundered along as best they could. In time, they arrived at a place in Mikawa province called Yatsuhashi. Where is Mikawa province? Just east of the capital. It would be present-day Aichi prefecture, right along the coast. Okay. And let's see what happens next. It was where the waters of a stream branched into 8 channels, each with its own bridge, which is why it had come to be called Yatsuhashi, or 8 bridges. They dismounted their horses under a tree near this marshy area and sat down to a meal of parched rice. One of them noticed some irises in bloom, blooming in the swamp. Compose a poem on the subject, A Traveler's Sentiments, beginning each line with a syllable from the word iris. The word iris in Japanese, sometimes referred to as kakitsubata. There are other terms, but in this case it's kakitsubata, he said. The man then recites the following poem. And why is it kakitsubata that has been used? Because, notice, if you look at the original Japanese, the first syllable in each line contains the sounds of the word kakitsubata. Right? So we have Hagoromo, Kitsutsu nare nishi tsumashi areba, harubaru kimuru, tabi o shizo omou. So we have kakitsubata. And this is ta, as in tabi. And so kakitsubata. I have a dear wife, familiar to me as skirts of a well-worn robe. And thus these distant travels darken my heart with sorrow. This is another example, a good example of a rather complex poem that contains a number of rhetorical devices. One is the fact that it contains an actual word of an object, and the name of an actual object. Here, it would be kakitsubata, or the iris flower, or iris plant. Poems that contain the name of a specific object hidden within the poem itself are sometimes referred to as mononona poems, because mono means thing, and then na means name. And you will find, in fact, an entire chapter or scroll containing poems like this in the Kokin Wakashu. So this was a fairly common or frequent method of writing, composing a poem, so that it would contain the name of a hidden object. Another rhetorical device found in this poem would be the takekotoba. Why? Because we have the word tsuma, which means, as you know, wife, but it can also mean the edge or corner of one's kimono garment, the hem. Right? It is also referred to as tsuma, right? But written with a different kanji character. So again, an example of the kind of convoluted, complicated, complex poetry that we find in this period. And at the same time, the poem still is able to meet the original objective, and that is to compose a poem on the subject, a traveler's sentiments. Here he talks about these distant travels that he has made from the capital. Right? He has journeyed all the way from the capital to this area, and his heart is darkened by sorrow, because he is now separated from his wife, who he has left in the capital. They all wept onto their rice until it swelled with moisture. On they journeyed to the province of Suruga. So they continue their journey to the next location, and that would be the location that we encountered a while ago at the end of the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, and that would be present-day Shizuoka Prefecture, where Mount Fuji, right? Mount Fuji is located. A pure white snow had fallen on Mount Fuji, even though it was the end of the 5th month. Fuji is a peak indifferent to season. What month does it think this? What month does it think this present day is? That snowflakes should be falling to spot its slopes like deerskin. So ordinarily you would expect Fuji to be covered with snow in the winter months, in the colder season, but in fact, even though it is already the 5th month under the lunar calendar, so in fact it is already the middle of summer. Right? The 5th month under the lunar calendar would correspond to the middle month of summer. But indeed we find snow has spotted the slopes of Mount Fuji. Spotted its slopes like the spotting that we would find on deerskin. So this is another use of metaphor. To speak in terms of the mountains around here, Mount Fuji is as tall as 20 Mount Hieis piled on top of one another, and it resembles a salt cone in shape. Mount Hiei. Most of you probably are familiar with this peak. It is the tallest peak in the eastern mountain range bordering the city of Kyoto. Right? So northeast of Kyoto, we find Mount Hiei. So we're located around here. And then what happens? Well, another poem is composed. And remember, keep in mind that they have used, the poet previously has used Mount Hiei as the unit of measure, right, for describing the height of Mount Fuji. Why would he use Mount Hiei? Now, let's look at the next poem. A white bird about as big as a snipe, with a red bill and red legs, was idling on the water, eating a fish. Its like was not to be seen in the capital, and nobody could say what it was. When they consulted the ferryman, he answered, "Why, that's a capital bird, of course." someone composed this poem based on this discovery of the capital bird. Capital bird in the original is referred to as miyakodori. Miyako meaning capital, and then tori meaning bird. If you are in truth what your name would tell us, if you, capital bird, are indeed, as your name would indicate, if you are indeed from the capital, let me ask you, capital bird, about the health of the one for whom I yearn. Right? Because he's looking at this capital bird, supposedly it has come from the capital, it's named capital bird, so he decides to ask the bird about the welfare of the loved ones he has left in the capital. Right? Now, upon hearing this poem, everyone in the boat shed tears. Let's think about this. Why are these references being made to the capital? It's probably pretty obvious. References to scenery in the Heian capital, the capital from which these men originate, from which they have traveled to make this journey to the outlying provinces, away from their loved ones. References to scenery in the Heian capital, for example, Mount Hiei, right, a well-known peak to all living in the capital. The capital bird, miyakodori, and yearning for loved ones, family, whom they have left behind in Heian-kyo. All of these will indicate the hardships, the loneliness of travel, especially travel to remote areas. Right? Now, keep this in mind because this will bring us to a new concept that we see not only in this chapter, but also in other works of Heian literature, and that is the concept of kishu-ryuri. Kishu-ryuri. And this is the last concept that I will go over today. But I would like for you to keep it in mind because it will become the topic of later group discussions. So you'll want to keep this particular concept in mind. Kishu-ryuri refers to the often aimless. Often aimless, meaning there is often no particular destination, no one particular destination that is aimed for. So it's that kind of travel to a remote area, and it's travel that is made usually by a member of the nobility. So someone who has a background, perhaps he's a member of the imperial family, or he's a member of the aristocracy. Normally you would expect people like that to stay in the capital, right, to be close to the capital, but in some cases, sometimes, as a result of exile from the capital for wrongdoing, for some sort of misdeed, we will find that members of the nobility, including members of the imperial family, are going to be sent away from the capital to other areas, often remote areas, far from the capital, far from their loved ones. We see this in this chapter in the Tales of Ise, and we will see it again, for example, next week and the following week in the Tale of Genji, in the chapters on Suma and Akashi. Did everyone get that down? So kishu-ryuri. Kishu itself means, or is a reference to someone of the nobility, someone of high background status and social status. And then ryuri, a reference to the idea of being sent away in exile to a remote area. We say in Japanese, nagasu, right? Nagasareta, right? To have been sent away, to have been sent in exile, banished from the capital. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and stop there today because from 12 o'clock they are going to be using this lecture hall for some sort of meeting, some sort of seminar on foreign study abroad. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you to bring the handout for this lecture to class next week. Do not forget the handout for this lecture. We will continue looking at the Tales of Ise, and next week is the lecture in which I will be giving you the paper topics for this course. All right, so I will give you the material in writing, I will also give you the form for the working bibliography and the form for the outline for your term paper. Both of these items will be due December the 16th. You have approximately 1 month to complete the outline and the working bibliography. Again, I will give you forms for both of those next week. You need to come to class to pick those up. If you cannot come to class next week, you need to come to my office as quickly as you can, as early as you can, to pick up both of those items. Okay? Any questions? I have one question for a student named Pak-san. Is Pak-san here today? Okay, we needed to talk about your situation. Please see me outside the classroom, if you could wait for me. Okay? Okay, I will see you next week.